This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Part of an episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken kicks off today's show. Drew and Joe discuss bobwhite quail and how predators can impact their population. Kansas Forest Service Forest Health Coordinator Shad Hufnagel continues the show by explaining why people should check their trees before spring weather in Kansas. He says what his recommendations are and what people should watch for. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he makes listeners aware of requirements that might be present for showing their animals. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
We're going to chat today about some terrestrial topics, and we're going to talk about a popular game bird, I think, today, Drew.
Yeah.
What do you got for us?
Well, you know, we've been talking about critters that cause damage a lot, and so I thought maybe coming into summertime, a time of the year when habitat management ought to be on people's minds. If it's not, if they're trying to manage wildlife populations, we can talk about northern bobwhite quail, most popular game bird probably in North America. Definitely a very popular game bird in North America.
Yeah, fun hearing them calling and just seeing the coveys out there. So, are they causing problems? You said we've been talking about a lot of animals that cause problems. What are the problems with the quail other than they get my blood pumping too much maybe when I see them flush?
Yeah, that's probably the main one. I mean, I can't think of a human wildlife conflict, that involves bobwhite quail besides just getting startled by them every once in a while. That especially in the dark, like walking into a tree stand, or when I used to check traps as a kid a lot on foot in the dark in the morning, and you step into a covey of quail and there's coyotes howling off in the distance.
Something's coming to get you for sure.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of times about predators, and predators can be coyotes, they can be, raccoons, whatever. So, I kind of, first of all, what are some of the predators of quail? And then I guess I'd like to know how concerned we should be about them. And are they knocking down the numbers? We get rid of all the predators. Will the quail jump back up? Just get your thoughts on all that.
Right. I think that the most common answer that people hear from biologists when biologists talk about this is that habitat is the key.
Yeah.
And what we should know is there's lots of different predators. There's hawks that kill adult quail, especially Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks. Bobcats, of course, get a few adult quail. I'm sure that a coyote gets an adult quail every once in a while, but that'd be pretty rare. Quail are fast. They're easy. They're good at detecting predators when they come in, and it would be pretty easy for them to get away from a coyote. If we think about quail nests, that's where the most predation probably occurs. So for quail nests, those same predators like coyotes and bobcats would get a few. Skunks, raccoons, opossums, armadillos. Those are the ones that people think about the most, right? When we look at the critters that get quail nests or quail eggs, there's some, if we stay on mammals, sometimes it's like mice or ground squirrel.
Really?
will depredate a ground nesting bird nest. And so there's some weird ones like that. But the big underestimated critters are like snakes. Right? I mean, there's a lot of depredation that occurs on ground nesting birds like quail from snakes out there too. So they're important.
Makes it sound like there's so many things preying on them. Maybe we can't control predators enough to help out the quail. Would that be right? Or
well, it depends. The reason that biologists tend to shy away from talking about predator control is there's very, very few studies that show positive impacts from predator control. And a lot of times when we're looking at that, we're looking at predator control by itself. So independent of any habitat metrics, does killing skunks or does killing raccoons or removing whatever, can we increase quail production or production of other ground nesting birds by removing those predators? And an interesting study, I think, is one that was done by some folks down at Tall Timbers Research Station in Florida. It's one of the pinnacle quail research facilities in the world, really. They had very, very intensive habitat management already in place. They had the habitat where it needed to be. And then they decided they were going to conduct predator control on mammals. And they also did what we call a before-after control impact study design. So they measured quail nest success, breeding propensity, all those different measures before they started predator control. Then on part of their study sites, they implemented predator control and still measured everything at all their study sites, and then they flip-flopped them. So they started doing predator control at the sites that were their control sites and then looked at everything and how it changed at the sites where they had previously done predator control but didn't do it now. So they also did something very different from what a lot of these other studies have done, and they hired 4 USDA Wildlife Services trappers to trap full-time from March to September. If we think about that, that's way, way more intense than the effort that most people put into this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you've got people who are professional trappers, that's what they do for a living, and they're out there running a trap line 8 hours a day, 7 days a week from March to September. That's the kind of effort that we're talking about, and there are 4 study sites, so there must have been 2 trappers at each study site. So they are one of the only studies that I've come across that shows a positive impact of predator control. So with that effort, they saw a 30% nest propensity increase. So they saw 30% more nests, 10% increase in nest success, 45% more chicks produced, and 18% increase in fall density. So from a hunter standpoint, what's that look like? That produced 0.2 of a quail per acre with predator control. And that's with hiring 2 full-time people to trap full-time.
What can we be doing on our property if we want more quail? What are some tangible things? Hiring 4 full-time trappers isn't going to happen on our property out there for most of us, but what are some things we can tangibly be doing that would make a difference?
Yeah. So, nesting cover and brooderine cover are the most common limiting factors throughout their range. So first off, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and give anybody recommendations without seeing a property and doing a habitat evaluation. Sure. But knowing that, do you have any native grass on your property? If you don't have any native grass on your property, then nesting cover is probably really, really, really limited. And if there's no nesting cover, it's going to be really hard to produce quail. That native grass needs to have some disturbance. So it needs to be grazed and burned, ideally, because that grazing is going to increase the plant diversity that's out there, and it's also going to help create that more patchy environment because cattle don't eat every plant the same. So that just patchy grazing pattern creates that difference in structure, difference in plant composition and everything. There was that study in southwest Missouri. They compared what we would call traditional quail management, which was what you see on some wildlife areas where we got a strip of woody cover, a strip of food plot, a strip of grass, a strip of shrubs, a strip of trees. They compared that with native prairie that had a fair bit of woody cover from brush, from shrubs, not necessarily trees, and looked at which had the best nest success, chick survival, adult survival, and all those sorts of things. For the most part, the native prairie that was burned and grazed had the highest chick survival, highest brood survival, and most of the reproductive parameters were better there too. And that's different from what a lot of people think. But the chicks actively avoided native grass that hadn't been burned or grazed for 2 years. So they selected native grass and had higher survival when the percentage of native grass in their home range that was burned and grazed within the last 2 years was higher.
Thinking about the harvest management side of things is maybe not as important as some of the other things, but just another consideration.
It is, for sure. And one of the interesting things about that is there was a study done in Kansas about 15 years ago that tied habitat conditions back to harvest. And so what they found was that they compared some native rangeland dominated areas to some cropland dominated areas, and they saw that hunting mortality was actually additive in areas that didn't have enough woody cover for the quail, because hunters, the quail escaped the hunters by getting into that woody cover. Another thing that they saw was that quail tended to do better in the cropland areas that they studied, but the rangeland-dominated areas in that study were overgrazed. So there, the quail were selecting the idle grass rather than the grass that was being burned and grazed, because they didn't have as good a range management going on out in that grassland. But woody cover can help those birds escape hunters, just like it does help them escape predation. The big difference is, a lot of times we'll see these numbers that might be out of South Texas or might be out of the Southeast that are recommending that we have 15 to 20% woody cover. That would be a lot of woody cover out in our tallgrass prairie. And so what they were seeing in that study that I was referencing was it was about 6% woody cover allowed those quail to escape the hunters out in that native rangeland.
Well, great discussion today, Drew. I love talking about quail, and I love seeing them, hearing them. Yeah, they're definitely a fun species to have around, and lots of good information to keep managing our populations, learn a little bit more about them, and hopefully we can see more of these quail out on the properties that we're walking around.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken and Drew Ricketts. You can check out this full Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode on Bobwhite Quail by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching on your favorite podcast platform. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about preparing trees for the severe storm season with Forest Health Coordinator with the Kansas Forest Service, Shad Hufnagel. Shad, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Shad, as we're thinking about trees and severe spring weather in Kansas, what do people need to keep in mind?
Obviously, storm damage and property damage that's associated with that is going to be probably paramount concern for most folks.
And while we're going to focus maybe a little bit more on trees that are already established, making sure they're okay. But first, if people are planting trees, what are a few things they should really consider?
Yeah, I think certainly an important factor to consider is for homes and trees to maintain healthy and good relationships and be good neighbors. Is to practice prevention, every chance possible. And that would include, making sure that the right tree ends up in the right spot, that is suited for the location, and not just based on aesthetics alone, but also how the tree might function in the landscape and its proximity to a home or other personal property.
How much should trees usually stay away from homes? What's that distance?
Well, it's going to depend on the tree species and what the mature height and spread of those trees is expected to be. There's smaller ornamental trees that can be placed in closer proximity to homes to kind of soften the corners or to, provide some kind of visual aesthetic value. But certainly lawn trees, or what we'd call lawn or street trees, they're going to become larger specimens that have broad spreading crowns that can be potentially problematic down the road. So those are the types of trees that we would encourage folks to really think long-term about and ensure that they're placed appropriate distance away from the home or, again, those personal property that you want to protect.
Also important to think about maybe how tall that tree could get for things that might be above it.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at utilities. So not only above the tree in its eventual reach, but also beneath it or, around its base as well. So that could include underground utilities, water lines, as well as overhead power lines and things of that sort that could potentially have some kind of conflict down the road.
And as we're in spring severe weather kind of season and all that is starting to take place, what are a few things that people should do when they see a tree on their property?
Probably one of the things that would be advantageous to do on a pretty routine and regular basis is to evaluate the trees, is to just go out and do an inspection on them. A lot of times our memory doesn't really serve us all that well or isn't kept up to date unless we provide reason for that. And so being intentional about going out, at the beginning of the season, after we get snow melt, we're outside a little bit more, go out and just kind of see how our landscape plants, including trees, have fared through the winter. And then especially as we get into, I guess, what we would call storm season, is to be a little more diligent with those efforts.
And when inspecting a tree, what are the things for people to look for?
On mature existing specimens, I think the features that you're going to be looking for the most are going to be dead, damaged, diseased wood. Also looking for hangers, plant material or tree material that's actually suspended. It's broken off and just suspended in the tree, waiting for gravity or heavy winds or something to displace it or dislodge it and throw it somewhere. But also, looking for fruiting bodies, fungal fruiting bodies that might be indicative of some sort of compromised structure or rot. And then also looking at the base of the tree as well to ensure that, that their flare roots are exposed, that it's got, it reflects what a healthy tree should look like.
When you say flare roots, what are those?
So at the base of a tree, typically, and some trees are kind of more, have flare roots that are a little more prominent than others, but basically as the tree trunk approaches the ground, there's going to be an area of where the trunk transitions into roots. And in that place, they're really just above ground level. You're going to see where these roots kind of flare out and kind of have a little bit of a taper to them as they enter the ground. And that's usually indicative of a tree that's been planted at the appropriate height.
If there are some loose limbs or limbs that are looking a little rough in the tree, do people need to go up and get those cleared and taken out?
Yeah, if it can be done so safely, that is an area where, I think personal confidence and ability would come into play, as well as competency with those sorts of things, making those kind of decisions and proper pruning cuts. Smaller trees, when they're being installed, can be pruned from the ground with an extension saw or pruners, or even before they're installed have some minor pruning performed when they're young or at the time of installation. As they mature, the idea is to hopefully have done enough pruning in their youth where you can minimize pruning efforts going forward because we've established a healthy crown and a nice sound branching structure. But in larger specimens that maybe haven't had the care over the years that would have provided a healthy branching structure, that may be a situation where a certified arborist could be consulted and potentially employed to perform some hazard mitigation and do some structural pruning, including crown reduction, and then again removing any hazards.
When might someone distinguish that it's time to just take out the whole tree?
Well, that's kind of a matter of preference. There are plenty of times where perfectly healthy trees are removed, and then there's also times where trees that warrant removal, immediate removal, are probably left standing for far too long. And so I think there's probably a lot of variables that come into play there, personal preference being one of those. But yeah. Looking at what stage of health the tree is in and what stage of life that tree is in, if it's in a senescent state where it's basically kind of aged out and is starting to show consistent rapid decline, and continual pruning efforts or hazard mitigation efforts are maybe not something that's real practical, maybe that's where removals would be a preferred control method.
How can someone tell if a tree has vigor and looks like it's going to stay healthy through the storm season?
Yeah, so just the general health and vigor of a tree, it's going to have healthy foliage. It's going to have, hopefully not a lot of dead branching up in its canopy. It's not going to have large cavities throughout the trunk or the crown of the tree. Also, well-distributed branching on all sides of the trees, and the tree is going to be, hopefully growing in a upright, non-leaning fashion, and so where it's, well-balanced and able to withstand some of those prevailing winds or storms as they come in.
And unfortunately, we know things just happen sometimes. And so as we're talking about trees and storms, is it important maybe to just move objects that can be moved if they're near big trees?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of targets in the landscape that can't be moved, our homes being one of those, or other structures, permanent structures on our sites. However, landscape amenities and outdoor patio furniture, and certainly vehicles and equipment are items or targets that could be moved prior to a storm. So if we're anticipating some inclement weather and we can get out proactively and try to safeguard some of our personal belongings, there's certainly benefit in that.
Shad, what's that checklist for farmers and ranchers or people in general as we enter storm season in spring in Kansas? What's your checklist of your top recommendations for them to go do?
Yeah, so kind of as mentioned earlier at the beginning of the season, actually getting out, boots on the ground, and going out and doing a visual inspection of the trees that are within our landscape, that especially those that are going to be in areas where there's potential for harm to occur. And that would include kind of a top-to-bottom inspection, at least as much as you can see from the ground. There's going to be areas that are going to be more difficult to see because of distance and just the inability to actually get up in the crown of the tree itself to inspect things. But, early in the spring, it's good to do that too, because they'll have less foliage on the trees, less obstructions to actually see kind of what's going on in the upper canopy of the tree.
Shad, if people have more questions about this, or maybe need to find an arborist to help take care of their tree, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, there's certainly things that homeowners can do as far as like just general maintenance and pruning on trees. Getting acquainted with what those practices look like is important. But there's also a time at which, certified arborists and trained professionals come in handy. And we would encourage folks to, if they're faced with a situation that they're not comfortable with or unfamiliar with or not quite sure how to tackle it going forward, certified arborists would be an appropriate path to take.
Shad, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was Forest Health Coordinator with the Kansas Forest Service, Shad Hufnagel, as he discussed preparing trees for storms, and he also mentioned things people should consider when it comes to planting trees around their property. As always, you can find out more information from the Kansas Forest Service by going to their website, kansasforest.org. Again, that is kansasforest.org. While you are on that page, one tool you might want to check out is the Wildfire Risk Assessment Portal, which is often referred to as WRAP. The Risk Assessment Portal can be a powerful tool for community planners to work towards reduction in wildfire risk. Again, you can find that on their website, kansasforest.org. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll have K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk for this week's Milk Lines.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. County fairs and exhibitions will soon be underway across the state for youth involved in a variety of organizations and clubs. However, recent disease and safety concerns have resulted in some changes to the procedures. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discusses some of the requirements for those showing dairy animals.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy industry concerning upcoming fairs this summer and the exhibitions that will occur as a result of those. As we think about summer and we think about county fairs and 4-H and FFA exhibits, we need to think about some of the requirements that go along with those events. Due to some of the issues that we've had with bird flu and other things in the past, we've taken a little different approach to some of the requirements to our fair activities. So, if you're planning on exhibiting animals at a county fair, and particularly if you're planning on exhibiting dairy animals, regardless of age, you need to be aware of those requirements and make sure that you follow all the rules. Please keep in mind that what I share could differ from what your actual county fair or exhibition actually requires, as each event can have different requirements. So please check the registration information for your particular event and make sure that you're following all of the requirements. When it comes to what is required at a county fair or at another type of livestock exhibition here in the state of Kansas, a lot of times we refer to the Kansas Department of Agriculture and particularly the Division of Animal Health. There are certain requirements that are state requirements and would be common to all events regardless of who is actually hosting those. So when it comes to dairy animals, it's a little different than what it is for beef animals. Dairy animals, regardless of age, are required to have some sort of official ID. Now, if that ID was placed after November 5th, 2024, it is required that it is an EID or an RFID tag. Now, this is true for all ages of animals, including dairy calves. So, if you're planning on showing a dairy animal, and particularly calves, at a county fair, just please be aware that when you check your animal in, you are required to have that animal tagged with an EID. If you need an EID, you can contact your local veterinarian, and they can probably help you obtain one of those. Some other things that you need to consider: if you would be bringing animals from outside the state of Kansas, requirements do change. If animals are coming across state lines, they will be required to have a certificate of veterinary inspection, and those permits must be issued prior to transporting those animals across state lines. Also, lactating dairy cattle that might be coming to a show here in Kansas from across state lines are also required to have a negative HPAI test within 7 days of movement to the fair. So if you are bringing something in from out of state that is lactating dairy animal, make sure that you have the official HPAI negative test along with the required CVI as well. So we want everyone to have a wonderful time at our local county fairs and other events during the summertime. Just want to remind you that all animals need to be disease-free when they show up to the show, so making sure that we don't have any clinical signs of infectious or contagious diseases in these animals is very important. If you show up to a show and your animal does have infectious or contagious disease, very likely you will be asked to return that animal to your home and not be permitted to show at the county fair or other event that you might be wanting to attend. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging you to make sure that you follow all the health requirements that are required for showing those animals.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.